There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. They aren't the ones you planned. They aren't the ones you rehearsed in your head while waiting for the coffee to brew, the ones you imagined would leave a mark. They are the small ones, the ones that happen in a stretching room at 10 at night with the gym empty and the air conditioning already turned off, and the single mirror on the wall reflecting an image you didn't ask to see. Lucas was 29, an architect, and had built his entire life around a single idea: control. Not in a violent way, not in a visible way, it was more subtle than that. It was the kind of control that looks exactly like competence working out at 7 p.m. every day of the week. An apartment always tidy with the precision of someone who leaves no trace, t-shirts always black or grey, projects delivered on time, conversations kept at just the right level of superficiality so they never got close to anything real. And that night, that specific Tuesday in the São Paulo autumn, when the windows were already dark at 10 o'clock and the gym's fluorescent lighting created an almost clinical quality in the air, something had changed irreversibly. He was facing the mirror in the stretching room in the back. Renato was there, and Lucas had seen, in that mirror, something he had spent 29 years learning not to see. But to understand what happened in that room, what Lucas saw in that reflection that made everything crumble all at once, we need to go back 3 weeks. We need to understand who Lucas was before that. We need to start at the beginning, which never feels like the beginning when you're in it, which only gains the clarity of a beginning when you're looking back. The gym belonged to Lucas before it belonged to anyone else. Not in the legal sense, it never was in the legal sense, but in the sense that matters, in the way a space can belong to someone through the sheer force of repetition and habit. He had arrived there for the first time on a December 3 years ago. A December he preferred not to unpack for other reasons. One that remained sealed in a mental folder, marked as resolved even if it wasn't, and he hadn't stopped since. 48 weeks a year, 5 days a week, 7 p.m. A constancy that the people around him sometimes commented on with a mix of admiration and a slight, almost imperceptible discomfort. Because there was something about Lucas's precision that wasn't entirely comfortable to observe up close for too long. Mr. Antonio was the owner, 62 years old, a medium and satisfied belly, a habit of permanently smelling like coffee even when nowhere near coffee, and that specific talent of certain older men to remember everyone's names as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He greeted Lucas every single time, "Good evening, Lucas." Even though Lucas had never given him any reason to be remembered other than always showing up at the same time, always leaving at the same time, and never causing any trouble. The gym had personality. That was something Lucas had noticed early on and quietly appreciated. It wasn't a franchise. It didn't have that sterility of places built for scale and social media photos. It was mid-sized, with floor-to-ceiling mirrors in the main room that reflected 16 angles of yourself simultaneously in whatever position you took. 16 versions of yourself working out at the same time, which had something slightly surreal about it, depending on the mood you walked in with. The equipment had been updated carefully over the years, never replaced just for the sake of renovating, never kept past the point of efficiency. The smell was that specific gym smell that is never exactly pleasant, but is at the same time associated with a series of things the body learns to crave. The rubber of the mats, the institutional air freshener that Mr. Antonio insisted on buying in bulk from the same brand, the sweat that the ceiling fan redistributed instead of eliminating. Carla was the receptionist. In her early 40s, hair dyed dark brown with that regular dedication of someone who isn't trying to look younger but simply prefers that color, a habit of saving the last cold bottle of water for whoever she knew would need it most. She knew everyone's schedules. She knew Lucas arrived at 7 p.m. and left at 9 p.m., and that never, in 3 years, had he arrived later than 7:05 or left later than 9:10. Lucas liked all of that. Not with the emotional intensity of the word, like with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has found a system that works and sees no reason to disrupt it. The gym fit into his routine without causing friction. His body was disciplined in there. His mind stayed quiet while his body worked. It was the only place he could achieve that specific silence, where the processing layers that were constantly active at the office and in his apartment simply went on standby, because his body was too busy with concrete things to leave room for the rest. Then Carla mentioned, On an ordinary Thursday in March, while he was signing the sign-in sheet with the pen attached to the counter by a string, because someone always took the loose pen, that Mr. Antonio was retiring, Lucas lifted the pen from the paper. He looked at her with the kind of attention he reserved for information that affected functioning systems. Is he selling it? Already sold. She said it with that specific lightness of someone sharing corporate gossip without realizing they are potentially pulling the rug out from under someone. A guy from São Paulo, actually. Renato something. Sounds like he's owned a gym before. He's showing up next week to meet the staff and do the transition. Lucas returned his pen to its lanyard. He filed the information in a mental folder labeled irrelevant. New management. Probably some minor operational changes. Monitor, but don't worry. He went to work out. The workout was just a workout. The information stayed right where it had been filed, quiet and catalogued, making no noise, for now. Renato showed up the following Monday, and Lucas realized with a 3-day delay that he had made a severe error in his cataloging. It wasn't dramatic. That was one of the details that made it all so hard to sort out later. There was nothing dramatic to point to, no single event that worked as a clear marker of where the problem had started. He was a 34-year-old man adjusting a bolt on one of the dumbbell racks near the entrance, with the naturalness of someone who had done it 200 times, as if the space had been his for a long time and not just for 2 days. Dark hair with a little grey at the temples, not the grey of someone getting old, but of someone who always had a few lighter strands and never worried about it. The build of someone who works out because they understand their own body, not because they need to show off to anyone. A faded blue t-shirt that was clearly old and that was clearly not causing any degree of existential angst to anyone wearing it. He wasn't announcing himself, he was simply present. Lucas noticed him upon walking in because he noticed everything. It was another thing that the people around him sometimes picked up on, but couldn't quite put a name to. There was a tactical reading of the room that happened before he moved through any space, a constant scanning, honed over years in a profession where details determined whether a project worked or collapsed. He would walk into a place and stand for a moment at the threshold, doing this silent read. Most people didn't notice. It was fast and had no visible markers, just that half-second pause before Lucas started to move. What he didn't expect was that right in that exact moment of reading the room, Renato would look up from the bolt. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds. Renato didn't smile with the salesman-like urgency of someone trying to demonstrate approachability. He didn't do that performative up-and-down head nod of recognition that people do when they want to signal they're a good guy. He just looked with a direct, unhurried attention that Lucas had no immediately available system to process, and then went back to the bolt with the exact same naturalness he'd had when he looked up. 2 seconds. Lucas went to the machines. During his workout, a set of bench presses, then shoulder presses, then the back circuit he had put together in a specific combination based on some old sciatica pain he had learned to manage. He accidentally noticed a few more things. The way Renato moved through the gym space, without the anxious energy of someone proving they belong, without the calculated expansiveness of someone who wants to be noticed, but with that specific ease of someone who has a functional relationship with their own body and isn't constantly negotiating with it. He chatted with 2 regulars who had been at the gym for years. Lucas knew them by sight, never knew their names, with a smoothness that suggested familiarity. Yet Lucas knew it was unlikely he actually knew them. He must have read their member files. Or maybe he was simply the kind of person for whom initial contact with strangers cost no discernible energy. Carla said something at the front desk that Lucas couldn't hear from his angle, and Renato laughed. A real laugh, the kind you don't decide to have, that bubbles up before you can manage it, one that wasn't being offered to anyone in particular. Lucas absorbed this detail too, despite his internal effort to ignore it. In the locker room, while changing his clothes, he made his final assessment. New owner, seems competent, won't cause problems. He'll probably change something about the class schedules or the equipment, just monitor it for a few weeks. It was one of the most wildly incorrect assessments he had made in a considerable amount of time. And the specific irony of this mistake was that the precision with which he had misjudged it was exactly proportional to the precision with which he always judged things correctly. As if the very same system that worked for everything else had a single specific blind spot, and Renato had walked right through the center of it. In the days that followed, the gym carried on with the same routine. Renato was there, sometimes in the admin area, sometimes chatting with a staff member, sometimes just moving through the space with that unhurried quality of presence that seemed to be his default setting. There were more crossed glances, brief, superficially neutral, the kind that happen between two people who regularly share a space without it needing to mean anything beyond civilized coexistence. Lucas logged every single one of them, even while swearing to himself that he didn't care. On Wednesday of the following week, Carla mentioned that Renato also worked out at the gym. He came in at 6 in the morning today, before opening. Sounds like he works out every day. She said it with the admiring tone of someone sharing a positive bit of trivia about the new boss. Lucas absorbed the information and immediately classified it as irrelevant to the functioning of his routine. It took up more space than it should have for an irrelevant piece of information. The problem with trying to keep up a self-deception is that the effort itself is a symptom. Genuine irrelevance is passive. You simply don't think about it. If you're actively reminding yourself that something doesn't matter, needing to reinforce that barrier with increasing frequency, then the blockade is already failing. Lucas reached this conclusion not explicitly, not as an articulated thought, but as a sort of friction that kept surfacing over the following week with an uncomfortable regularity. On Wednesday, at the office, adjusting the proportions of a residential floor plan that needed refinement before Friday's presentation, Lucas realized he had spent an unquantifiable amount of time of varying depth thinking about a head tilt. Not any specific head at least, that was how he framed it to himself at first, because there was a convenient vagueness available there. He was thinking about a gesture, a pattern of attention, about what certain people do when they are genuinely listening to something. The entire body leans slightly toward the source, as if wanting to get closer to what's coming, and there's a quality of pause in the face that isn't passivity, but the exact opposite internal activity while the exterior stays still. Renato did that. Lucas closed the floor plan on his monitor, opened it again, adjusted a 2mm margin that didn't need adjusting. He reasoned, with the practicality of someone who had built his own identity on rational foundations, that he was simply interpreting the new management as a statistical risk to his peace of mind. It was a legitimate concern. 3 years of constancy relied on the continuity of a pattern. It was reasonable to monitor it. The specific problem with that explanation was that the things he was monitoring weren't the relevant variables for assessing operational risk at a gym. It wasn't the cleanliness of the equipment that lingered in his short-term register when he tried to sleep. It was the specific silence Renato maintained when someone was talking, not the silence of absence, not the silence of someone waiting for a gap to speak, but the silence of someone who is truly present inside what is being said, genuinely processing it. The texture of that 2-second glance the first time, which hadn't been long enough to be unsettling, but had been direct enough that it couldn't be classified as neutral. The specific way his laugh had escaped before any decision to let it out. Lucas went back to the gym on Thursday with a clear resolution. Normalcy, work out, leave. Do not register anything that wasn't relevant to the operational assessment. Renato was in the cardio area when he walked in. Lucas went to the weights. He didn't look at the cardio area, he worked out. He left at 9:04 p.m. On the sidewalk, 15 meters from the gym, he realized he had switched machines mid-workout for no technical reason whatsoever. He had abandoned his lat pull-down routine on the third set of 4 and moved to the cable machine with no programming logic he could articulate. He filed this away as an isolated anomaly. On Friday, he returned with a firmer resolution. On Friday, he left at 9:02 p.m., and he had noticed, against his own will, that Renato consistently wore faded t-shirts, an indication of a genuine preference for well-washed fabric. That familiarity of clothes that have lost their stiffness and yielded to time. The following week, on a Monday, Lucas lost track of time. This was unusual. It was, in fact, so unusual that when he realized it, when he looked at the clock on the treadmill console and the display read 9:48, his first reaction was a kind of physical disorientation, as if his body had breached a protocol so highly automated that he had stopped checking whether it was being followed. 7 p.m. entry, 9 p.m. exit. That was the code. The code had failed. The gym was in its emptying out phase. Two guys in the weight area were finishing their last set with that late-night rush, and the woman on the treadmill next to him had turned off her machine some 10 minutes ago and left. Carla had already been replaced by the night shift receptionist, a younger girl whose name Lucas had never learned because he never stayed until the end of the night shift, and she was putting on her jacket with her phone in her other hand, staring at the screen with the universal, unmistakable energy of someone 2 minutes away from leaving. Lucas was on the treadmill. There was no technical reason to keep going. He should leave. He didn't turn off the treadmill. Renato emerged from the back. The night rounds, Lucas realized later, with the benefit of hindsight, what he hadn't grasped in the moment because at the time he was busy managing the disorientation of losing track of time, the checking of equipment and lights before the formal closing. He approached with the same unhurried quality of movement that had caught Lucas's attention during the first week, carrying a clipboard with a checklist, a small two-way radio clipped to his belt that occasionally crackled with the static of an unused frequency. He noticed Lucas on the treadmill from about 5 meters away. He showed no surprise. Still working out? It wasn't a judgment. It was an observation, the tone of someone stating a fact without assigning any weight to it. I lost track of time. Lucas paused the treadmill. This was, he would acknowledge later, the first time in that entire sequence of weeks that a truth had slipped out before his internal sensor could contain it. Renato nodded with the brevity of someone who hears a fact without feeling the urge to dissect it. Then he said, with the same casualness of someone reporting a problem with the air conditioning, "No problem. Finish up if you need to. I've got about 20 minutes before closing. There's no rush." Lucas said he didn't need to finish. He stayed. It wasn't a deliberate decision. It was an absence of decision, which is a different and more honest way of choosing. The kind where your cognitive justification system hasn't kicked in yet because you're still pretending to yourself that you're leaving in a minute. He stepped off the treadmill. He went to the water fountain. He was genuinely thirsty. So at least that was a concrete reason and didn't sound like an excuse, even internally. He went back for a set of shoulder presses that he had already done once that workout. He did it again. There was no program that justified doing shoulder presses twice in the same session, but there was the fact that redoing a familiar set was a way to keep the body occupied while everything else was put on hold. Renato continued his rounds. He turned off the lights in the secondary weight room, checked the temperature on the AC panel and adjusted it by 2 degrees, and checked the lock on a piece of equipment that was slightly loose and which he had complained about fixing since the first week. The night receptionist said goodnight and left. The 2 guys lifting weights left shortly after, with the sound of backpacks slung over their shoulders and chatting about some bar. The gym was empty, except for the 2 of them. When Renato returned to the main area after his rounds, he stopped at a distance that wasn't close, but also wasn't marked by the unnecessary vastness of someone who is deliberately creating space. He stood there with his clipboard in hand. He looked at Lucas, not with the intensity of someone examining him, but with the quiet attention of someone who is simply present. "What do you do for work?" The question came without any built-up context. It just appeared, as if it were the natural continuation of a conversation that was already happening on some level. Lucas said, "Architecture. Residential projects mostly. Some commercial stuff when the firm took it on. The occasional historical renovation that popped up." Renato said, "That makes sense." Lucas asked why it made sense. And Renato looked around the gym, slowly, with that attention he put into things, at the mirrors on the wall, at the weights Lucas had returned to the rack in exact ascending order without anyone asking him to, at the space around the last treadmill Lucas had used, which was slightly reorganized with a precision that wasn't in the equipment's original design. "The way you use space," Renato said, "it's very specific. You always put things back in the exact same spot. You always use the same treadmill even when the others are free. You stand at the exact same angle to the mirror during your workout." A pause. "Is that the kind of thing an architect does, or the kind of thing this specific architect does?" Lucas didn't have a ready answer for that, not because the question was technically difficult, but because it had cut deeper than any question had the right to in a genuine first encounter conversation with the gym owner after hours. He said it was time to go. He grabbed his towel, his backpack. He said his goodbyes with the polite haste of someone who had activated an immediate escape plan. Out on the sidewalk, walking with long strides with the autumn wind in his face, that São Paulo breeze that chills the back of your neck and slips down your collar, Lucas noticed that the pulse in his throat was more violent than the treadmill had ever managed to provoke. He didn't catalogue that anywhere. It was the first item on a list he had decided didn't exist. Over the next 3 days, Lucas tested normalcy with the same methodological rigor he applied to design problems on a deadline. Monday, he arrived at 7 p.m., ran his set program, and left at exactly 9 p.m. Renato was in the makeshift office in the back with the door ajar, a muffled, incomprehensible phone conversation drifting out from inside. They didn't cross paths. A clean exit, system functioning. Tuesday, same structure, same execution. Renato was in the reception area when Lucas arrived, talking to Carla about a hygiene equipment supplier who had delayed a delivery. They exchanged a nod of recognition, the kind you exchange with someone who regularly exists in the same space without it having to mean anything beyond civilized coexistence. Lucas went to the weights. He left at 9:05. 5 extra minutes, irrelevant within the margin of error. Wednesday, it was working. The structure was supporting its own weight. Backed by 2 days of reasonably solid evidence, Lucas had come to the conclusion that Monday's episode had been exactly what he'd catalogued it as after it happened. A perceptual anomaly caused by a break in routine. The physiologically accelerated body was just the central nervous system's activation response to an altered environment, not a sign of anything more specific than that. Wednesday, during his workout, at a few minutes past 8, Renato walked down the aisle between the weight machines and the cardio area, without stopping, with no apparent intention other than passing through. He mentioned in the tone of someone casually observing something in passing, "I renovated the stretching room in the back. New lighting, new mats. The old ones were starting to smell. Have you been back there yet?" Lucas said no. "You should go." Renato was already walking away as he said it, not waiting for an answer, not marking the moment as significant. Stretching is the half of the workout that everyone ignores, especially those who lift weights. He walked off. Lucas continued his set. Finished. Did the next one, left at 9:03. The phrase lingered, not as an event, as an echo. The naturalness with which it had been said made it impossible to turn it into an object of analysis without seeming ridiculous, and Lucas recognized ridiculous when he saw it, including in his own cognition. It was an observation about stretching. It was literally an observation about stretching. But that night in his apartment, trying to review a renovation project that needed attention before early tomorrow, the phrase came back 3 times. On the 4th, Lucas closed his laptop. On Thursday afternoon, before going to the gym, he researched the benefits of post-workout stretching for heavy weightlifters. He found abundant and convincing literature. That wasn't the reason. On Thursday night, he walked into the stretching room for the first time. Renato wasn't there. The room was smaller than the main one, much smaller, almost intimate by comparison. The yellowish lighting that Renato had installed created a completely different atmosphere from the cold fluorescence that regulated the rest of the gym. Warmer, less clinical, the kind of light you find in bedrooms and living rooms, not in public spaces. A single mirror covered the front wall from end to end, not the 16 simultaneous angles of the large room, just one, you and yourself, without variations. New mats stacked in a corner with the smell of new rubber still faintly present. The generic gym playlist reached here muffled, as if from underwater or an adjacent room, losing its ability to create the neutral background it did in the rest of the space. Lucas stretched for 20 minutes, alone facing the single mirror with the yellowish lighting and the specific silence of that space. Quads, hamstrings, glutes, a basic sequence he had read about in one of the fitness media outlets he sometimes consulted without much engagement. He left without knowing what he was looking for. But he had gone there. He had spent 20 minutes in that space. And he had noticed, unintentionally, unable to avoid noticing, that the space had a different quality, that the single mirror, without the 16 angles of the main room, reflected an image of you that was somehow harder to ignore, that the yellowish lighting stripped away the clinical quality that made the large room a place where you could be efficient without needing to be present. He had gone alone. He had rehearsed the space without the main piece, and there was, without being able to articulate it precisely enough to construct a proper denial, an uncomfortable clarity about the fact that he hadn't gone looking for improved flexibility. A week and a day after his first visit to the stretching room, Lucas was there again. Late, 9:32, the formal closing time had passed, but Renato had said the first time that he could finish up, and that permission had developed an unspoken permanence that Lucas hadn't questioned, because questioning it would mean examining why he was using the permission with increasing frequency. He was doing the quad stretch, right, then left, facing the mirror, alone with the yellowish lighting and the silence that seeped in from outside as a present thing, not as an absence of sound. São Paulo at night has a background hum that never completely disappears. Engines, a distant bar, a honk that lasts a second and fades away. Here it arrived filtered, transformed into something that was almost white noise. He heard the footsteps in the hallway before he heard anything else. The door opened. Renato walked in with the precise familiarity of someone who knows the space intimately. The closing rounds, Lucas understood immediately, the standard check of the lights and equipment before calling it a day. A clipboard was in his hand, the radio on his belt. He had seen the light on under the door and came to check. There was no calculation in it, no preparation. Or at least that was how Lucas needed it to be, so he could continue keeping his breathing at a rhythm that wouldn't give anything away. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Lucas with that quiet attention. Still around. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "I'll be done soon," Lucas said. He didn't move to leave, because leaving immediately would be admitting there was a reason to leave immediately. Renato stood in the doorway for the moment in which he could have said goodnight and moved on. He didn't. He came in. He leaned against the side wall with the clipboard resting on his lap, possessing that quality of stillness that wasn't an absence of weight, but the exact opposite, a presence that had substance, that occupied the available space without needing to expand to do so. He stayed silent for a moment that with anyone else in any other context would have been uncomfortable. With Renato, it never was. It was just silence. "Hamstrings," he said finally, observing Lucas's position. "You're doing it in the most inefficient way possible." Lucas looked at him through the mirror. "Is there a right way?" "There's a better way." Pause, with zero urgency. "With assistance, it's more effective. You can go deeper without your muscles locking up in compensation. It's the neural pull that happens when you try to force it alone." There were 12 reasons to say no. "Thanks, I'm good like this. I've seen how to do it on YouTube. I already have a training program." Lucas knew all 12 of them in varying detail. He had processed them in seconds. He said, "You can." What followed was completely technical. That needed to be said. It needed to be established as a fact because it was true. It was absolutely within the boundaries of what any professional in the field does with anyone in a gym, physical therapy, or movement instruction context, without either side needing to think twice about what is happening. Lucas's problem wasn't that he didn't know this. It was that knowing it wasn't helping. Renato was 34 years old and had the hands of someone who had used his own body his entire life with functional awareness. Not the performative awareness of someone who is always monitoring how they look, but the practical awareness of someone who understands how joints work, where tension settles without warning, what pressure releases and what compresses. When he positioned Lucas's leg for the first hamstring stretch, the movement was precise, the exact angle. The pressure calibrated to the point where the muscle yields without the protective reflex kicking in and locking everything back up. "Relax your femur," Renato said. As if it were simple, as if Lucas hadn't spent the last 29 years practicing the exact opposite art. The thing about assisted stretching, about any form of physical assistance that requires surrendering control, is that it has an effect on the nervous system that goes beyond the specific muscle being worked on. There is something about the position of being supported, of having the angle sustained by another person, of relying on an external force to maintain form, that communicates an instruction to lower vigilance to the autonomic nervous system. The body learns that it doesn't need to hold on all by itself. And when the body learns that, other layers follow by association. The bubble of pragmatism that Lucas used as social armor, that millimeter-precise calculation of distance that made interactions safe by keeping them strictly cold, began to give way with a slowness he was unable to track, too focused on the effort of pretending to act natural. Renato worked through the hamstrings on both sides, then the glutes, then the adductors. Each transition was announced by a brief instruction. Turn here, bend your knee, inhale before releasing, given with the same functional tone of someone describing the steps of a technical procedure. Professional, nothing but professional. And while he worked, he asked questions. Not intimate ones. Conversational questions, the kind that fill the space of a physical work session without demanding too much from either side. What Lucas designed, if it was more residential or commercial, if he had chosen the field or if the field had chosen him. Lucas answered. And here was the central problem of that entire night. He answered with more honesty than he had planned. Not because Renato had done anything to extract honesty, simply because the physical position, the surrender of control, the proximity that was technical, but that the body didn't process as merely technical, all these things operated below the level where impression management decisions are made. He said he had chosen architecture because there was something comforting about projects where the variables could be controlled, that a well-designed space moved people in predictable ways. The width of a hallway determined whether people walked fast or slow. The height of the ceiling determined whether the room felt expansive or cozy. The position of the windows determined where the eye rested. That there was something safe about knowing that if you put the right pieces in the right places, the result would follow. He said something safe and didn't immediately realize the weight of what he had placed on those two words. Renato stayed quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that precedes an observation, not the absence of a response. Then, and does it work? What? Designing the space to control how things move inside it. Pause, unhurried. In general, I mean. As a strategy. Lucas remained silent for the time his breathing required to reorganize itself. Sometimes, he said. Renato nodded with that brief movement of someone who receives an answer and takes it seriously. He moved on to the next muscle group. The conversation moved on to other places. The gym renovation, the new mats he had ordered from a physical therapy supplier because they were denser and lasted longer. The way São Paulo in autumn has that specific late afternoon quality that Renato had never found in any other city he'd lived in. Lucas kept answering, kept being present. The difference between hearing and listening is small in the lexicon and enormous in practice. Hearing is passive. The sound arrives, the brain processes just enough so you can respond without seeming completely absent. Listening requires you to actually be there, that what is coming in goes somewhere beyond the auditory cortex. Lucas spent most of life's conversations hearing. With Renato, in that room, in that position of surrender forced by the stretch itself, he was listening in a way he didn't recognize as his pattern. Renato said he had lived in Curitiba for 5 years before moving back to São Paulo, that he had learned to manage gyms with a partner who understood more about business than training, and that the combination had worked until it didn't. He said this without apparent bitterness, with the placidity of someone who has processed an experience and come out the other side without needing any narrative to explain it anymore. Just the fact, clean. Lucas said he understood partnerships that work until they don't. He said that and then fell silent because he had said more than he had planned to say in that specific sentence. Renato didn't push it. He didn't ask the follow-up question that would open the door for more. He just gave a slight nod, that same thoughtful gesture Lucas had memorized weeks ago, and said, "The gym here has a different energy, since the day I joined." Energy like what? Lucas asked. The people who come here aren't the ones who need to be seen working out. They're the ones who really need to work out. A pause. You're like that. Lucas didn't answer right away. The observation had landed in a way his defense mechanisms had slowly learned they couldn't block, not because it was invasive, but because it was accurate. There was something particularly disarming about being seen by someone who wasn't using what they saw for anything other than stating a fact. "I come here because it works," he finally said. "I know." Renato slightly adjusted the support angle. "That's why I said it." And at some point during the adductor stretch, when Renato repositioned the angle with a functional precision that required a balance adjustment, and Lucas had to lean in slightly to maintain his position, and the distance between them closed for the geometric time necessary for the movement, Lucas looked at the mirror. He wasn't looking to see anything. That was the central detail he couldn't rearrange later into any more comfortable shape. He hadn't sought out the mirror. He hadn't looked up with any intention. It was simply there. The mirror was just there, and the angle of the exercise, the specific positioning of the assisted adductor stretch, brought his own face into focus in a way that hadn't happened once in the previous weeks. Not his body, his face. And what he saw wasn't the mask he managed. It wasn't the disciplined neutrality he had cultivated for so many years that it had become a second skin. It wasn't the corporate armor. It wasn't the calculated detachment. It wasn't any of the barriers he kept up around the clock. It was the naked vulnerability beneath it all, the expression that surfaces when the mind is too overwhelmed to uphold the facade. It was the face of someone resting in the exact place they longed to be, even without ever having given themselves permission to do so. Lucas knew that expression, not because he had seen it on his own face before, because he had spent years consciously or not, which was a question he wasn't in a position to determine at that moment. Learning to recognize it on other faces and looking away before he could draw any analogy. What he saw lasted fractions of a second, the time it takes for the brain to capture an image before the management system can intervene. Renato continued the movement, his hands at the right angle, the pressure calibrated, everything within the technical parameters established at the start of the session. But the mirror wasn't technical. The mirror was just honest. There's one thing mirrors do that photos don't, and security cameras don't. They give back the present. Not the carefully selected angle of a selfie, not the image you prepared with the 1 second of advance notice it takes for the camera to snap. The mirror is right now, the face in that exact frame of right now, without the half second of preparation you use to manage what's going to show up. Lucas had gotten good at managing the half second. He had gotten so good that he'd stopped noticing he was managing it. The neutral expression had become automatic. The disciplined neutrality had simply become his face. The layer of control had merged with the surface to the point of not looking like a layer at all. Just who he was, except the mirror had caught the moment between the frames. The moment when his body was too busy with balance and position and the real conversation that had taken place and the proximity that was technical and that his nervous system wasn't processing as just technical, and the layer of control had been left behind for a second. A single second that the mirror had captured and returned with the perfect indifference of surfaces that have no agenda other than to reflect. Lucas didn't move. It wasn't a decision not to move. It was the system shutting down, like when you open a door you didn't expect to be unlocked, and your body stops completely before your mind understands what happened. The processing pause before the action. The expression in the mirror didn't say he was wanting to cross any boundaries. It said something simpler and somehow more devastating. You were already here. You had already been here for longer than you had admitted to anyone, including yourself. It wasn't new. It didn't start with Renato. It started earlier, at some point that honest archaeology would have to unearth, and it had been kept out of the realm of language because language creates reality, and the created reality would have implications that the unspoken agreement had determined were unbearable. The unspoken agreement. That agreement Lucas had made with his own fear, without explicitly negotiating any of the clauses, that the question would never truly land, that he would never allow the words to get close enough to create a concept that could be affirmed or denied. That as long as there was no language, there was no reality. That as long as there was no reality, there was no consequence. The mirror didn't need language. The mirror just gave back what was there. "That's enough for today," Lucas said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. That was somehow the most unsettling detail of all, that he could still sound like himself in the exact moment he felt the ground shift beneath his feet without any warning. Renato stopped his movement. He held his position for a moment before stepping back, with that same calm presence that had been his consistent trademark since day one. He didn't ask if everything was okay. He didn't make that performative face of concern people do when they notice someone's mood has drastically changed and they don't know how to react to it. Lucas stood up. He grabbed his towel. He started packing up his things with stiff mechanical movements, the silent agitation of someone who needs to flee a room before reality fully sets in. an evasion tactic he had perfected over years to escape whenever intimacy threatened to breach his defenses. The backpack went over his shoulder, his sneakers were tied, the door was a meter away. Lucas was a meter away from the doorknob when Renato said, "You have great timing for ignoring the obvious." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, there was no heavy accusation, no heat of resentment. It was said in the tone of someone making a factual observation about the bus schedule or the weather outside, with the specific tranquility of someone who is already on the other side of a process you are still in the middle of, who has already been through the part that hurts the most and has the temporal perspective to look back on it with a certain serenity. Lucas stopped. His hand was on the doorknob. The door was a quarter turn away from opening. Outside was the hallway, the empty gym, the exit, the sidewalk, the subway, his apartment, and the entire life he had built around a compromise that had just been called out by someone who hadn't agreed to participate in it and who had apparently figured out the terms without needing them spelled out. He kept his hand on the doorknob for what felt much longer than the clock would show. The doorknob was cold. Lucas noticed this in a way he normally wouldn't. The cold metal beneath his palm, the specific weight of a gym door that is heavier than an apartment door because it has to withstand more people pushing it with greater force. Concrete details the brain seeks out when trying to anchor itself to anything other than what it's currently processing. What goes through someone's mind in that moment, in that second and a half or 2 seconds between pausing with a hand on the doorknob and whatever happens next, isn't articulate. It's not words, it's layers of simultaneous things that language later tries to capture and never fully manages to. There's the weight of the compromise and the exhaustion of keeping it up. There's the mirror and what the mirror had shown that could no longer be denied by any categorization he was capable of constructing. There's Renato behind him in that small yellow-lit room who had stated a truth about Lucas as naturally as someone commenting on the weather. And underneath all of that, there is one simple question that the compromise had kept from landing for so long. What if it isn't unbearable? What if the burden of what is hidden is heavier than the burden of what would be named? Lucas turned around. There was no orchestrated confession. That needed to be clear. There was no perfect sequence of words, no script recited automatically out of nervousness. There was no speech. There was just Lucas in the middle of the room, facing Renato, under the amber light, the mirror reflecting them both, and the muffled street noise invading the space like a continuous hum. For a moment, he didn't say anything. They stayed like that, the two of them, the room, the silence that didn't demand to be filled. Then Lucas said, "How long have you known?" Renato tilted his head slightly, that gesture that had been catalogued weeks ago and had never left his short-term memory. "Since you stayed on the treadmill after hours for the first time. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks and 3 days. The precision of that number made something specific happen in Lucas's chest. Not painful, just heavy, the way things are heavy when they have real substance. Someone had paid enough attention to count the days. Not to use that attention as leverage, they had just paid attention. "You've been through this process," Lucas said. It wasn't a question. It was the confirmation of a hunch that had matured in secret, disguised under the label of mere managerial curiosity. "I have." Renato stayed quiet for a second, not with the silence of someone choosing their words, but the silence of someone being honest about what came before, what they are about to say. "It took me longer than you in some parts, less in others." Lucas looked at the mirror, the reflection of the two of them in the small room, the distance between them having shifted shape without either of them moving in any measurable way. "I don't know what to do with this. I know. And nothing for now." Renato said it with a simplicity that Lucas realized in that moment was the kindest thing anyone had said to him in an amount of time he couldn't accurately calculate. There was no compressed expectation in the words. There was no timeline, no pressure, no performative opening demanding a specific and immediate response. It was just the confirmation that what was happening could happen at the pace it needed to happen. That there was no rush, that rushing wasn't the only alternative to stagnation. They stayed in the room for a while longer. On the clock, probably about 20 minutes, maybe less, maybe more, the kind of time that loses precision when you stop tracking it with the anxiety of someone who needs to know exactly where they are. They talked about things that were and weren't at the same time what they had just talked about. Renato talked about the gym, what he had found when he took over, a pulley machine that had a cable problem for months and that Seu Antonio had put off fixing for unclear reasons. The idea of opening a yoga studio that the physical space allowed for but depended on finding the right teacher. Lucas asked about the yoga, not because he needed to know, but because he was genuinely curious about how Renato had arrived at the idea of a space that combined a weightlifting gym with a softer bodily awareness practice. Renato spoke for a few minutes about how he had realized that both audiences were actually the same audience at different moments in their own relationship with their bodies, that the person lifting heavy weights at 6 in the morning was often exactly the person who needed silence and stretching at 7. Lucas truly listened, with the attention of someone who is truly present, not managing a conversation from within a structure of safe distance. The distance between them was different. It hadn't disappeared. It would be dishonest to say it had disappeared. And Lucas had reached a point that night where dishonesty cost more than he allowed himself. But it had changed in quality. It was no longer the distance he maintained with architectural precision to ensure nothing got close enough for the question to land. It was a different space, one he hadn't designed, one that had emerged on its own. When Lucas finally left, the gym was completely silent, and the autumn São Paulo outside had that specific quality of weeknights when the street movement has cooled down to the essentials. The slightly damp asphalt from a drizzle that had stopped before becoming real rain, the smell of earth from the square on the next block, the baseline noise of the city that never completely stops but changes texture as the hour advances. He walked to the subway with his hands in his pockets. He got into the car. He remained standing even with empty seats because he needed the physical effort of balancing himself. He needed to feel the jolt of the train bumping the floor under his shoes, while his mind still tried to absorb the magnitude of his own internal tremor. He looked at the dark glass of the subway window. The reflection looked back, imperfect, distorted by the imperfections of the glass and the speed and the light of the car, fragmented, shifting, incomplete. This time, he didn't look away. In the days that followed, the external world didn't change. The office had the same projects, with the same clients, with the same deadlines. The apartment had the same arrangement, the same controlled temperature, the same breakfast prepared in the same sequence. His t-shirts were still black or grey. He hadn't promised anyone he'd change that. There was no reason to, and there was something mildly comforting in noticing that some things remained the way they were, because that's how they were, and not because there was any suppression system holding them in place. The gym was the same gym. But when Lucas walked in the following Tuesday at 7 p.m., as always, and Renato was at the reception desk talking to Carla about the new fitness center that had opened 2 blocks away and was running an enrollment promotion, and Renato looked up and Lucas's eyes didn't look away. The cost of that had changed. It hadn't disappeared. The habit of looking away takes years of practice and doesn't unravel in a single moment of clarity. And Lucas knew this with the precision of someone who had been the architect of his own life, with too much dedication to have naive illusions about the pace of renovations. But the weight had changed. The named truth, even if only to himself, even if only to the mirror, even if only in that small room for 20 minutes, carries a different weight than the suppressed truth. Less heavy, not light, not without consequences, not without the work that still lay ahead, but different. Lucas went to train. He did his program for the day. He left at 9 p.m. The following week, he went to the stretching room. Renato was there. Nothing happened that the external world would classify as an event. There was no declaration, there was no gesture that crossed any boundary that was still being established at the pace it needed to be established. There was the small space with the yellowish lighting and the single mirror and the conversation that had that quality, which Lucas was beginning to recognize as a specific quality and not as the absence of something else, of 2 men who were in the same place, truly present, without needing to fill the available space with anything other than what was there. The mirror in the stretching room was still the mirror. It reflected back what was there. It hadn't learned to be gentle with it. But Lucas had learned, he was learning in a slow and non-linear way, like all real things, not to look away. If you've made it this far in this story, you probably know some version of this room. That inner space, not a gym mirror, but the metaphorical one, where a truth waits with the infinite patience of something that knows it has time because it always has. That question you decided not to ask, because asking it would give it a weight you weren't ready to carry yet. That deal you made with your own fear without explicitly negotiating the terms, because implicit terms were easier to keep than explicit ones would be to break. Lucas didn't resolve anything that night. There is no clean resolution for these stories, and you should deeply distrust any narrative that offers one. Resolving implies an endpoint, and the endpoint isn't like that. It's a continuous movement. It's a series of small choices you make over and over every time, not a single decision that cancels the need for all the subsequent ones. What happened that night was a small choice. Lucas kept his hand on the doorknob for 1 second longer. Then he turned around when turning around was harder than walking out. Then he stayed in the room when staying was truer than anything leaving had to offer. That's always the choice that matters. Not the grand gesture, not the rehearsed speech, not the cinematic moment that would arrive once you were ready. The extra second before running away. The time you turn around instead of walking out. You know this moment, you know where your doorknob is. And perhaps if you're reading this right now, it's because you are in that split second of difference. With your hand already on the cold metal, the weight of the door already in your palm, and the hallway outside offering exactly the same escape it always has. If this story touched on something you are also carrying, let us know in the comments. It could be a word, a sentence, that quiet recognition that needs no elaboration, the "I know this place" that is worth more than any argument about why it matters. And if you want to keep hearing stories that aren't afraid to be true, that don't look away from the mirror, subscribe here. We have so much more to tell.